Welcome to the Career Now podcast. My name is Jed Lea-Henry, your host, and on today's show we have Steven Denney, doctoral candidate at the University of Toronto, fellow at the Asian Institute at the Munk School of Global Affairs, senior editor of Sino-NK, and regular contributor to the Diplomat magazine. Today we're going to be building a picture of Korean nationalism. Nationalism, wherever it's found, is an incredibly nebulous idea. It's something we all hold as absolutely true about ourselves, but when asked about it, it's incredibly hard for us to actually define what it is. And of course, this is no different for Koreans. Nationalism involves a whole range of inexplicit ideas. The build-up of culture, the attachment to history, the creation of a unifying narrative, and, in the famous words of Ben Anderson, the imagination of a community. For some, Korean nationalism looks back 5,000 years, goes back to a divine progenitor, Tangun, then builds up over the ancient Joseon dynasty, forward into the Three Kingdoms, then narrowing down into a single unifying country. But nothing defines people better than a common enemy, a grievance, something to fight against. And modern Korean nationalism builds out of a resistance against Japanese colonization. So at the turn of the 20th century, Koreans begin to find themselves for what they stand against. And this lingers through to today. And from these early nascent beginnings, the process of Korean modernity is pushed forward at a lightning pace by the speed of the economic development of the country itself. A country playing developmental catch-up is also by definition a country whose social development is also compressed as well. Korea today is a country that glorifies its early democratic beginnings, and in many ways it is a fully consolidated democracy. But it is not without its challenges in this regard. A new, younger generation of Koreans are finding themselves excluded from the life that their parents lived. Around them, they're just not seeing a meritocratic society. They're seeing hereditary privilege. They're seeing an imposing nationalistic structure. They're seeing limitations on their own expression and their freedom of speech. And they see a value of social unity and conformity over individual expression. And looming over all of this is the spectre of North Korea. A considerable portion of Korean nationalism today is pan-Korean nationalism, the idea of a minjok, a single bloodline, a mono-ethnic society. And in this regard, the push for reunification is not just a political good or a human rights issue, but a nationalistic emergency, a grievous error of history that needs correcting. But nothing could be harder. The challenges of unifying a country and in a modern multicultural globalized world, bringing them together under a single ethnic identity is never going to be easy. And for 30,000 North Korean defectors who now live in South Korea, this is a reality that they face every day, a challenge that they have to overcome, and something that they struggle to find. So perhaps unsurprisingly, Korean nationalism is struggling to find itself, and an incredibly hard issue to pin down. But with Steven Denney today, we hope to do this. As always, if you enjoyed the podcast and you want it to continue, please consider contributing at Patreon. The link is attached below. So, without any further ado, this is Steven Denney. Steven Denney, welcome to the Career Now podcast.
Thanks for having me on.
No problem. So we're going to walk through Korean nationalism today. And I suppose it's important, at least at the start, to plant a flag as far back as possible. So we might go back to ancient Korea, past Joseon dynasty, past the Three Kingdoms, to ancient Joseon, maybe even Tangun. So what role, if any, do you think these historical narratives and stories play into Korean identity today?
Well, it's a big question, and I will not give a complete, thorough, or just answer, I'm sure. But as a way to, as you put it, plant the flag somewhere, the role that the conception of an ancient Korea plays is to backdate the nation to several thousands of years ago, to trace the history of the Korean people. The Tangun myth is the most well-known, and that has to do with ethnic and perhaps national origins. It's a discourse that became quite popular at the onset of, let's call it, modern Korea, as controversial as that simple statement might be. And this is a discourse started at around the early 20th century when Korea was seeking to identify what it meant to be Korean. And this is the origins of the conversations had about when the Korean nation would have begun. And it is in the interest of nationalists, those who seek to define and defend the territorial national sovereignty of this thing we call Korea, to link it with myths of national origin that go back as far as possible, really.
Sure. And also in that period, there's a huge competing diversity of narrative, isn't there? So there's this, and it runs back a lot, but these ideas of Buddhism and the beginnings of Christianity and Neo-Confucianism and a whole, you begin to see the origins of the challenges of Korean nationalism.
Indeed. Nationalism itself is, to many, I would include myself in this category, a sometimes very elusive concept. And when we talk about Korean nationalism, what are we talking about? But I think what we're talking about is a sort of a political force, even a movement, which seeks to define the qualities and content of a national people, who they are, and what their mission or perhaps even destiny is. And it's a thoroughly political idea, which seeks to, combine like peoples based on some defined characteristics or attributes, those of which I'm sure we're going to talk about a bit more going forward here.
Yeah. Just on that point there, do you tend to see nationalism, like you said, it's a hard thing to really pin down, but do you tend to see at least some of it in terms of Ben Anderson's famous dictum as an imagined community?
Oh, it absolutely is an imagined community. As a Canadian or an American, the idea that you are somehow connected to someone who you don't know. If a Canadian sitting in Toronto feels in any way connected to someone, sitting in a cafe in Calgary, who they've never met, who they'll never meet, who they know nothing about, but somehow they feel connected to them, that's the imaginary community to which Ben Anderson was alluding, the origins of which he claims is in the offspring of empire who settled in the Americas. And this feeling of being a part of a community, but not quite of the metropole, created a distinct political community around which these people could believe in. The advent of the printing press was the catalyst, the mechanism which would ensure that these people knew about one another, and that is the historical argument that Ben Anderson is making about an imagined community, about people feeling that they belong to some thing which you cannot see, touch, smell, or taste, but it exists and people believe in it.
Yeah. So let's run this forward then to quite a few years forward. So let's run towards Japanese colonization. And this becomes a very common idea, and people that are familiar with China would see this as well, that Korea begins to define itself in opposition to Japan.
Right. So in the literature on Korean nationalism, there are many who pinpoint its origins, or its definitive origins, when it really became a thing, in and around the late 1910s to 1920s. You had a plethora of literature and nationalists, self-proclaimed Korean nationalists, who sought to define the culture, customs, and people of Korea. And what it means to be a national people is defined by what you are not. And there's no better way to stir up feelings of national, or in this case, ethnic sameness, oneness, or being, than to try to deny people that, which was what happened when the Japanese colonized, annexed the Korean peninsula into the greater Japanese empire, and sort of half-heartedly told them that they soon would be one with the Japanese nation. Everyone knew or understood that was not quite true. And in opposition to that began the Korean nationalists, the modern Korean nationalist movement. There's a few in the English language literature, there's a few people who have written some very seminal works on that. Andre Schmid's Korea Between Empires is perhaps one of the most well-known, where he talks about this movement whereby Korea, which had always been sort of aligned in the Sinocentric world order, de-Sinified. As part of this process of defining the ethnic and national self. Henry Im at Yonsei University has written a very similar book about Korean national or nationalist historiography, where he sort of traces the origin of this conversation to the same period, where he has written a separate piece where he sort of defines the origins of the word minjok, the word that's most often used or was once often used to refer to the Korean nation, sort of doubles in meaning as ethnicity or ethnic group, something along those lines. He would claim that the origins of the use of that word is in this period, and for them that's key.
Yeah. So that tends to linger, doesn't it? So it begins with this Japanese colonization and Korea pushing back and finding themselves in this, but it still lingers today and still quite strong. So you still have protests on the streets about war crimes, protests about comfort women, protests about Dokdo, this little island off the coast that is uninhabitable for most extents, but it's a real national feel, a real national fervor begins to build around these things still today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it is worth pointing out that to a large extent, again, I say this with quotes perhaps, or just with great trepidation, that modern Korean national identity or modern Korean identity, as we understand it, is in large parts defined by a particular opposition to, it's not, when I say opposition to Japan, I don't mean the Japanese people per se, but to to Japanese militarism, a certain anti-Japanese sentiment that is inextricably linked to militarism and the aggressive imperial project that was sought by pre-war Japan.
So how organic do you think that is? How natural do you believe that is? Is it something that people really feel in their hearts, or is it something that's really been imposed upon them for political purposes from parties and politicians?
Well, I think it's a little bit of both. Anthony Smith, a well-known English, I believe he's English, scholar of nationalism, talks about the deep ethnic roots of the national communities, tying them to sense of family or tribal linkages. But insofar as the national, as we understand it today, nationalism, nation states, and nationhood, very much modern constructs. The outcomes of political movements and political projects, one of which what we're talking about right now, and that is, well, what it means to be a modern Korean. And I think that is, many historians would agree, others would disagree with, but I think it's largely accepted that these are the products of modernizing processes, colonization in reaction to it. And then following that, we cannot forget the nation-building projects in South Korea and North Korea by its early foundational figures, Kim Il-sung, Park Chung-hee, and the like.
And this also begins to draw some links, this particular period, to China, because China, at least in ancient Korean history, has this feel of not so much a dominating power, but someone who the traditional Middle Kingdom idea, someone who's brought through technology and literature and new ideas. And China and Korea tend to bond over this sense of grievance towards Japan. And if you go to places like Manchuria, there are indeed statues and memorials to people and to Korean freedom fighters, that especially to do with the 1919 assassination of the Japanese Prime Minister.
Right. I think you were alluding to the Anjungun Memorial at Harbin train station, the original train station. Yeah, that is, if you want a site of memory, as it's referred to, someplace where you can go to kind of see, perhaps better understand the deep-seated ideational issues in Northeast Asia. That's one of them. So I highly recommend those who are capable or go to China pay a visit to Harbin, go to the original train station, which is still functional. There's a small but tidy and well constructed, aesthetically, museum/memorial to the so-called great patriotic martyr An Jung-geun, who shot down Ito Hirobumi, who was the first governor general of Korea and a prime minister of Japan. It's notable that both Korea and China would, Park Geun-hye in particular, Xi Jinping in China would cooperate in order to see that place is constructed. That is notable indeed.
So let's move on a little bit here to some of the experiences of rapid development inside Korea. So after the Second World War, they then have a Korean War, and after a few stuttering years, the Korean state begins to really emerge and grow extremely fast. And you refer to this as compressed modernity, the idea that they are growing incredibly fast, but with that fast development comes an incredibly rapid and sped up social change as well.
Sure, not my term, but one which I readily employ, because I think, that's fine. I don't know who actually came up with that. Someone in the probably in the developmental state literature. In any case, you described it quite well. The rapid social, economic, and as a consequence, political developments in the region. Yes.
Yeah. So what sort of disconnection does that cause for the modern Korean state? Because you sort of get this idea, at least today, that there's a certain feeling of really being torn away from the fabric of Korean nationalism, Korean identity, and Korean culture. That it is all today about money and growth and being rich and powerful.
Oh, that's a big question. I don't have a good definitive answer on this. In fact, I would say that the compressed modernity, a part parcel of that project was to build a nation, to define it. And if I can refer to both Kim Il-sung and Park Chung-hee as being somewhat similar, if you will allow me to do that. Mm-hmm. If you look at the rhetoric they use during this time of like very compressed modernization, they are extorting their people, the Minjok specifically, that word is used, to great feats, to great heights. So when it comes to an understanding of social groups, or how like a sense of national understanding is created and understood, I think if anything, this great modernization project was part of also a nation building project, where they said, our nation, which has been torn down, must be rebuilt. The people of Korea must, come together to reach great heights. That's not a direct quote from anyone, but I'm summarizing effectively the kind of language that was used by both Kim Il-sung and Park Chung-hee. And it's really interesting if you look at it, because it's often indistinguishable one from the other.
So sorry.
It's very indistinguishable from one another, full stop.
Okay, no problem. So South Korea today is an incredibly capitalist society. It's a lot of focus on growth and development, as most Western countries are, even though it's not Western. But this developmental state hit a brick wall with the Asian financial crisis. And so the first time that modern Koreans really became disillusioned with the idea of capitalism itself, that there can be some challenges and some pitfalls to the free market economy.
In 1997, the Asian financial crisis really definitively brought an end to South Korea's developmental state. It instilled a sense of vulnerability of economic insecurity. To what extent does that affect the perception of national identity, nationalism? I think it's a little unclear. If anything, I think the rapid growth maintained for a long time, plus the increasing, it's called modernization of South Korea. I mean, South Korea is an extraordinarily modern place. I think that this idea of being developed, rather, of being specifically a member of the OECD. For South Korea specifically, it was the first country to go from aid recipient to aid donor. This is enormously powerful and an important part of how South Koreans think of themselves and their place in the world. And if anything, it has, I think, generated an understanding of what it means to be Korea that is more closely aligned with other countries in what we would refer to as the developed world, parts of Western Europe, North America. What's interesting there, though, is that, North Korea has not taken the same path. They, while they're not a command economy, they are sort of a highly unregulated, uncertain, nascent market economy. They're still exist under exclusive authoritarian political institutions. They're not economically free. In any case, they've taken very different trajectories, and that has most certainly affected how they understand what it means to be Korean and how they see their place in the world vis-a-vis other countries.
So in that particular area, so as we move forward through, as Korea is growing and it's becoming richer, there becomes a huge romanticization about this generation that came of age in the 1980s, and that's because they are the people that struggled for democracy, and they begin to define Korea as completely different to the North, of course, but this is the generation that made modern Korea in the lives of many people.
Absolutely, the 386 generation, the Sambaryuk-sedae, they occupy a special place, I think, in the annals of recent Korean history, especially the history of democratization, because these are the people who were coming of age. They were, say, between 18 and 25 in the 1980s, which was a time of transition for South Korea. They play a particular role that I will readily admit I do not think is fully appreciated or understood. There are, a number of studies in the Korean language about this generation, who they are, what they mean, what they're doing now. But aside from Nami Lee's book on the Minjung, which is sort of a study of a particular subset of that generation in the 1980s, those who were really active, who were going into the factories, who were out on the streets leading the protesters. Aside from that book, there isn't really a whole lot to go on. But everyone seems to know who this generation is. They've at least heard of the letters 386 together. But I would admit myself too that I often just think of them as this generation in between those who came of age under early, like late colonial period, early and high authoritarianism and democracy, and they sort of ushered everything in. So who were they? How did those experiences matter, and what are they doing now? I think are big questions that I can't really give you any answers to here, but I think you are right to identify them as, special or particular to the story that is modern Korea, that is post-war Korea, that is South Korea. Yeah.
So something follows out of that, though, doesn't it? So this idea, when you glorify a generation for struggling for democracy, rather than glorifying democracy itself, you begin to move towards a type of politics which becomes personality-driven, a sort of focus on charismatic leaders rather than on policies and politicians and political parties. Sorry.
Right. Whether or not what you've just identified is any relation to the democratization struggle, I think it probably does. Personality politics in South Korea is it's one of its defining characteristics. It's interesting. It's puzzling in an academic sense that South Korea is, by all measures, a consolidated democracy. That is, democracy really is the only game in town. And I think with the peaceful impeachment and removal of Park Geun-hye, I think that was shown to the world definitively. Despite this, the political parties, they're sort of vessels often for individual, highly charismatic leaders. They're not empty vessels. No, not at all. But, compared to perhaps the better known politics of Canada, the United States, Britain, and so on, where you have parties which stand for like a certain set of policies, a programmatic platform, as it's sometimes called. You don't really have that in South Korea, and that's almost certainly linked to the path of development it took, and how the timing and the sequences of that development was different from elsewhere. But individuals, yes, politically speaking, in short, matter more in South Korea than they do in other consolidated democracies.
And on that line, there are some very clear divisions across the Korean Peninsula, which come from quite historical, some grievances and some just family and communal unity. So there's a very clear divide, on at least in voting patterns, between the two halves of the peninsula. Seoul is its own place, so to speak, but the east of the country tends to be conservative, at least down near Busan, and the west, especially near the Jeolla provinces, are very socialistic and very left-leaning. And this is a very hard to erase divide. It's always there in every election.
It is, yeah. The Jeolla Gyeongsang divide, and that's again traced to the processes, developmental processes in Korea, specifically that Park Chung-hee came from the southeast, and he tended to favor the southeast for development, for investment, and you can still see it today. I lived for a year and a half in Gwangju, which is in the southwest, and it is noticeably different. It just has a different feel. Structurally, it's different. It's laid out different. The development is different between, say, that and somewhere in and around Busan. And the politics of those two areas are different. The southwest, where Gwangju is, and Jeolla, well, the north and south Jeolla province, the Honam area, as it's referred to, there's more of a politics of struggle, as they might refer to it, and that is linked to certain liberal politicking, liberal politics, liberal politicians. There's a so-called Honam line, which traces sort of its roots to certain struggles, but most notably to Kim Dae-jung, who was from there. That's why it was notable that Moon Jae-in won so much of the southeast. I mean, he doesn't have the same ties. He's not from Gwangju. He's not from Honam, and he was able to carry a lot of the vote in the southeast, and that's certainly notable. But these two places, the southwest votes almost always liberal, sometimes overwhelmingly so. The southeast is a little bit more varied, but the further up north you go in that region, the more decidedly conservative they become. And these are, these cleavages in South Korean society, this regionalism, as it's referred to, is predictable and enduring.
So let's move on to another cleavage, and one that was very obvious with the election and the rule of Park Geun-hye, the previous president, one that was impeached in South Korea. There's a very clear generational gap, which at least developing inside Korea, where the older generation tends to be much more conservative, as you would expect, and the younger generation is a lot more progressive, a lot more left-leaning, and it tends to be the older generation that were bringing Park Geun-hye and other conservative leaders into power. And this is also significant because it's now an aging society inside Korea, isn't it?
Yeah. Hey, first and foremost, it's important to point out that older people everywhere tend to be more conservative. There's a life cycle process that takes place where people grow up, settle down, get a house or an apartment, start a family, have a stable job, etc., and that these experiences tend to make people more conservative. However, there are also, as you point out, certain generational differences, things that aren't linked to that process, that have to do with the experiences of different groups of people in society. And there are a number of new studies, new research being done, including my own, which would identify, in addition to different, perhaps, political preferences, voting behavior, also new ideas of what it means to be Korean today. such that, those who are older have ideas which are very, very different from the younger folks.
So on that idea, this older generation voting in Park Geun-hye and at least attaching themselves to a more conservative leader. One of the things that was at least noticeable is that when she was running for election, her father, of course, was Park Geun-hye, and he was at least in part an authoritarian leader, not in his earliest years, but he certainly became one. And as she was running for election, it was almost like a positive behind her. The shadow of her father, it was like a symbol of devotion to the nation, her commitment. And as things turned against her, the shadow kind of shifted, and it became this looming shadow of authoritarianism. And there's sort of this competing image inside Korea today.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think at first it was a political boon that she was able to capitalize on the legacy of her father. And that is, in many ways, the legacy of the Conservative Party, and that is development, political, economic development. And it is it's important. I mean, Park Chung-hee, had he retired, so I need to attribute this to Chalmers Johnson, who wrote on Japan very frequently and China. He talked about how if Park Chung-hee had retired in 1969 rather than pursuing power consolidation, he would be remembered as the greatest Korean to ever live. But we know he didn't, and he pursued more power, eventually, implementing the Yushin Constitution at the beginning of the 70s, consolidating his power and ushering in a period of real authoritarian rule. It's the dark years of modern South Korea. People look past that. They'll admit that not everything was great, but Park Chung-hee built this nation, to put it simply, almost too simply. And that's a politically simple and powerful message. And if you're the daughter of that man, you can see how far that can go at the polls. So it's really a testament to how far she really fell and how hard she fell after having, basically won an election on, in large part, her father's legacy. I don't mean to take away anything from Park Geun-hye as a politician. She was popular in her own right, but it's impossible to not say that a lot of her political capital was earned because of the legacy of her father.
So let's move towards that fall just a little bit. And it's impossible to speak about Korean nationalism without at least speaking about something important that was important during her rule, the renationalization of textbooks. Now, this is an issue in other countries around the world, of course, but it became a very big issue inside Korea during the time of Park Geun-hye.
It did. Korean textbooks have, it was only recently, okay, where can we start with this? The national control over textbooks has long been an aspect of Korean education. In the mid-2000s, they began to be liberalized, whereby a government body would review and give authorization for private textbook makers to produce textbooks. Under her rule, it was deemed that there was too much quote-unquote leftist influence on the writing and I guess subsequently the teaching of Korean history. So it was decided that these Korean textbooks would be renationalized. This didn't go over so well. There was huge pushback against it, and the order was eventually rescinded. It never was fully implemented. But I think the takeaway from this, I mean, the politics and the specifics of that debate are interesting in their own right. And I think people really need to remember that it wasn't until very recently that they were, partially liberalized. But trying to renationalize them restarted this debate between leftists and rightists interpretations of history, historiography, and that it highlights the huge divide that the interpretation of history has in South Korea. So to give a specific example, a so-called leftist interpretation of Korean modern history, so we're talking about after the Korean War, would portray Park Chung-hee's rule in a more, let's call it negative light. It would be much, much more critical that, despite some success, economic success, it was, a politically oppressive regime that tortured its own people. It would emphasize the continuity between the nationalist movement in the colonial period, especially the March 1st movement. And it would offer a sort of more pan-Korean national history, something which tends to include both North and South Korea. A rightist interpretation is going to focus much more on developments tied to the Republic of Korea, that is South Korea. They're going to give let's call it more friendly interpretation of the Park Chung-hee years. They're going to emphasize on the importance of building national industry, which is the foundation of national strength upon which a nation and a state were built and consolidated. And so when this debate was reignited, when working with the Ministry of Education, the Park Geun-hye administration, ordered the renationalization of textbook production, it revolved around a lot of these central themes about, who is Korea? What is Korea? When did it begin? Or not necessarily when did it begin, but how far back do we trace the origins of South Korea? Like, is it with is it 1919 with a big march against Japan proclamations? Then the Constitution basically says so, but rightists, especially new rightists, tend to say that the nation really begins with the creation of the Republic of Korea. So since we're talking here about national identity and nationalism, this textbook debate is integral to that debate at a much higher political level. And it's another cleavage in South Korean society.
And it was just one of many scandals that littered the Park Geun-hye years. So we don't have to get into all of those things. It'll take forever, I suppose. But there is one interesting moment, and I wonder what you think about this. The actual protests on the streets of Seoul and other capitals and other cities around Korea that brought down Park Geun-hye. Because this is a country, South Korea, where large-scale public protests that block infrastructure are not commonly allowed, not very often that you see such things. But this was a huge national protest, and it actually brought out a lot of the same conservatives, the older generation that had voted for her, came out to protest against her, as if there was some sort of broken trust that they were fighting against here.
Right, the pro-Park Geun-hye protests, decidedly less exciting, far less people, but interesting in a way. And I think it highlights, underscores, shows very clearly that the differing interpretations of what South Koreans think is, say, a state identity, that is, what is a democracy? For the older folks, I think there is a greater emphasis on deference to leadership, a greater emphasis on uninterrupted rule for the executive, in this case, a president, and a sort of an opposition to the messiness that I think we would positively associate with consolidated democracy, that is the freedom to assemble and to oppose things which you do not like. And when it comes to defining what South Korea is, there's a clear divide. There, which moreover is tied to the Park legacy, and that is to remove Park Geun-hye as sort of a stain on that legacy. To say nothing about some of the, I think, disagreements with the legal proceedings and how the Constitutional Court handled the case, given the immense social pressure To say nothing about that, I mean, there are fair questions to be asked about that, about judicial impartiality in the face of millions of people protesting for someone to be removed. But it really, I think, to focus specifically on this interesting group. I mean, it's not an interesting group. These are older folks in South Korea who identify as strongly conservative, which is to them is anti-communist. And to remove the leader in South Korea is to put the country in great peril, to make it vulnerable, to challenge the rightfulness of the elected leader of the country to rule. And they just have ideas that deep down are very different from younger folks who came of age, who have grown up under democratic rule, or perhaps grew up in the 1980s, again, to identify this 386 generation. People before that and the 386 and after, they're going to have very different views about what makes a good political system and what defines the identity of the country.
So let's move on to that younger generation that you just mentioned there. There's a few interesting moments in Korean history recently, such as the nut rage incident, where the daughter of a famous chaebol, these large family-owned conglomerates, effectively had a mini tantrum on a flight, and then it becomes a great big court case. But the image of this was a nation finally looking at these elite families, and this idea that despite what they do, they're never going to be in that position of power. And there's a growing feeling inside this younger generation that Korea is not a meritocratic society anymore, or maybe it never was.
There's a catchy phrase that's been used to capture the sentiment. It's called Hell Chosun, and it's basically, as you said, it's the idea that Korea is some sort of pre-modern sort of lord serf like social and political structure where people don't rise based upon their merit or how hard they work, but their lot in life is set from birth. And I think this is aggravated by the precarity, I think, or the very real social dislocations caused by later stages of capitalism in South Korea. That is, its post-industrial transition. It's moved from a developmental state into a developed capitalist country. So the problems that a lot of developed capitalist liberal democracies are facing are the same in South Korea, but I think appropriate for Korea. They're a bit more intense there, befitting a country that experienced compressed modernity. And the frustration for young people at the inability to find meaningful and well-paying work, despite enduring the grueling hours required in South Korea's education system, the hagwons, the private schools, the cram schools, etc. The inability to find meaningful, well-paying work frustrates many, such that this is how they express themselves, and this is sort of the concept that's been developed to capture that frustration. Further to that, as you pointed out, there's this idea that again, one's lot in life is set from birth, based upon family connections or status, and there's nothing you can do about it. That too is frustrating to them, and it's given rise to a detectable, a written about sense of discontent, of a social discontent of younger South Koreans who don't feel like they have the same opportunities that were granted to their mothers, fathers, and grandparents.
There's also a clash there, though, isn't there? Because despite that lack of merit that I suppose a lot of people have recognized for a long time, Korea is also a society that has this commitment to this idea of hard work. That if you work hard, you'll achieve good things and you'll get whatever you like. And along those lines, they have these big commitments to standardized testing. So on the surface, it looks meritocratic. Some of the ideas are. but people just can't achieve what they like. And I suppose what you're hinting at there's a growing underclass of young Koreans.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that. I don't have the statistics to hand, but the number of, what do they call them? NEET, N-E-E-T, I think it's not employed or in educational training, is troublingly high in South Korea, which is indicative of the inability, again, for young people to find meaningful, decent paying work that befits appropriate to the amount of time they've spent preparing for the labor market.
Okay. Let's shift direction just slightly here, and we're going to walk into North Korea a little bit here. But just on that journey in, you've written a lot about Korean multiculturalism, and you mentioned earlier the idea of the Minjok, this idea of a single ethnic Korean community. But of course, South Korea today is just not that at all. It's got a whole raft of different cultures and communities here. But it still holds on to this idea of this Minjok in certain ways, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. I think it's worth stating that, 25 years ago, say the early 90s, South Korea didn't really have many immigrants. There's always been U.S. soldiers there, GIs, but there some other foreigners, of course, hasn't been closed off. But the social transformation that is taking place right now, as South Korea has graduated to a new structural position within the global economy, as an importer of labor, and as a destination for people who are either ethnic Korean but of a different nationality, or neither ethnic Korean and of a different not ethnic Korean and of a different nationality, has increased, such that, again, statistics are in front of me, but in the late 90s there were several hundreds of thousands of documented foreigners, and today there's several millions, such that, depending on your projections, in a not too distant future, South Korea will meet the definition for a multicultural society, which is 5% foreign-born population, something to that effect. So South Korea is moving from being an ethnically homogenous society, which you could say celebrated that, to a increasingly diverse, pluralistic, arguably multicultural society, which the government has also recognized. So in South Korea, you have multicultural policies. You have institutes at universities for raising awareness of multiculturalism, civic and government-led initiatives to help newcomers to South Korea integrate, to learn the Korean language, to learn Korean customs, to learn how to fix kimchi, etc.
Sure.
And that's nothing short to me of an amazing transformation, again, befitting the Korean developmental experience.
And some of those new migrants, North Koreans, of course, about 30,000 North Koreans now live in South Korea. And of course, as soon as they arrive, they have automatic South Korean citizenship, and they helped out quite a lot. But that automatic citizenship comes about because they are effectively one nation divided in two. But there's a younger generation of South Koreans that begin not to see it this way. They think they are, in fact, two nations, two countries, and it once again this divide between the old and the young about North Korea, about a unified Korea, and about a potential reunification. It's very visible again, isn't it?
It is, and again, this is a contentious claim, as all claims about nationhood and belonging are. that younger people have, again, as I was alluding to before, a different national identity from older people, and that North Korea to them is increasingly just another country. I think that the research, including my own, would support this conclusion, that they see North Koreans as simply different. And, just objectively speaking, they are. Like, they are physically different. They speak with a different Korean accent. They come from a place that is increasingly culturally different. It has different social and political institutions. So I think the idea that North and South Koreans are the same is just objectively false. Now, this is not to say that the idea of a pan-Korean ethnic nation isn't necessarily wrong, because there's a history to that, which is true. I mean, the Korean Peninsula, as we know, it was once unified. That's not wrong. We know that's true. But this divide, the divide that split Koreans unwillingly into the north and to the south, has, because of the differences in their developmental trajectories, sort of, created peoples who are very, very, very different from one another. And, the resettlement of North Koreans into South Korean society, it really highlights that. And, I mean, you can see it in the understanding that these newcomers from North Korea have in their experiences, in their surprises and their disappointments, that they recognize, as much as South Koreans do, that there are some really significant differences. Now, again, this is not to say that, and I think this is really worth pointing out, because we always think of ethnic nationalism as something to be avoided, right? Because it's inherently exclusive. And for a society that's increasingly multicultural, as we've described South Korea, a strong ethnic nationalism would exclude those who are very different, who don't share Korean ethnicity, and just generally ethnic nationalism is seen as something to be avoided. Now, in this case, it's also something which can bridge a gap for those resettling. So there's a lot of interesting dynamics going on here, which really bring out and help us understand how the societies of these two countries have developed and how they've diverged, and how that divergence can, be overcome, perhaps.
So the North Korean state, at least much more than the South, still holds the idea of a Minjok quite strong, right? This is one of the core principles of the state. One day we will reunify the peninsula. And of course, as you mentioned just then, when North Koreans do come south, they automatically, I mean, it's kind of hard to avoid because of their education and their background. They automatically tend to become second-class citizens because they're competing in a tough, capitalistic, normal society in some ways. And part of that means they become an underclass, and there's certain degrees of discrimination. So what place do you think North Korean defectors have in a future South Korean nationalism?
Right. Wow. Big question again. It's a good one.
Yep.
I think there's a couple of things to say here. First of all, I think you're right, and I think the general understanding is that resettled North Korean migrants, newcomers from North Korea, 탈북민 or 탈북자, however you want to refer to them, they are not on the same level as native-born South Koreans because of the disadvantages due to their backgrounds. However, I think that the narrative which sort of promotes the idea that they belong to an underclass, that they are completely disadvantaged, disillusioned, and dissatisfied is, that's over-egging the pudding a little bit. What I see in my own research and what I've seen in many others is that those who come from North Korea who are able to reintegrate through education primarily. I mean, education is that mechanism which creates and sustains a nation. And if you're a North Korean who's resettled in South Korea, you can go back to school. You can make those social networks. You can learn those values. You can adopt an appropriate accent. That is, you can drop your North Korean accent. You effectively become South Korean. And in my experience of interviewing and being around North Korean defectors, those of a younger age, those who came in their teens, mid to late teens, early 20s, it's often very hard to even know that they're from North Korea. It's those who are a bit older, especially the oldest. It's hard to put a number on it, but let's say those above 42, above 45. They have the hardest time sort of adjusting, assimilating, or becoming South Korean effectively. And I think for them, the dissatisfaction, the feeling of dislocation is very real, and it's much harder for them. So to the question of to what role do these newcomers play in, the sense of a new South Korea, I think there's two answers to that. They are going to seem mutually exclusive, but they need not be. The first is that they're going to, elicit, catalyze, or rejuvenate a sense of Koreanness, of one Koreanness, of a unified pan-Korean identity. I think that the type of pan-Korean ethnic nationalism of the developmental years cannot be recreated today. It's just not possible. It's completely incompatible with, I think, a lot of the ideas of the younger generation. More inclusive democratic ideas, universalist principles of citizenship, nationhood, and belonging. It's incompatible with that. However, it doesn't need to entirely be. In the idea that, the historical reality that North and South Korea were once one can be a basis of an idea that, North Koreans should be part of the Korean nation because, they once were. But that doesn't mean that we negate sort of our democratic identity as an increasingly pluralistic, multicultural place, which leads me to the second one, is that North Koreans are a new group in South Korea among many other new groups in South Korea who all have the right to claim membership and belonging in a democratic nation. And I think that is maybe the more, it's certainly idealistic, most certainly, but ideally, democracy produces an inclusive notion of belonging, that you belong because you have citizenship, you belong because you feel Korean, you belong because you want to be here, you belong because you speak Korean. And I think North Koreans also play a part in promoting and reinforcing that idea of a new South Korean nationalism.
So on that point, as a final question here, let's finish on a absolutely impressive piece of research that you've done about this phenomena of the few people that do come south or do defect to other countries and then re-defect back to North Korea. And when they do get there, there's these huge press conferences that are run for them, and the North Koreans build up their own sense of nationalism through it, as in they've been tricked to leave the country, and there's a dangerous, nasty world out there, and you shouldn't leave.
Yes, so re-defectors, of which there have been not many.
So what are those re-defectors thinking? What is it that's taken them back to North Korea? Because the instinct would be, once out of a place like that, you'd never want to get back in. But something is drawing them back in.
Right. So I haven't been able to talk with them, so I can't tell you exactly what they're thinking. But I do know what they say once they're there, what tends to happen, and sort of the differing interpretations. So one is that it really plays on the dissatisfaction narrative that life in South Korea is hard, competition is too great, these people are taken advantage of, and so they want to go back. I think there's truth to that. There's a lot of truth to that. Life is hard for resettling North Koreans. I mean, as we've discussed, life is hard for South Koreans native born. However, a lot of what we know about why these people supposedly leave comes about because of these carefully choreographed re-defector press conferences that are held in Pyongyang once these re-defectors come back to North Korea. And, these press conferences really double down on the South Korea is, a capitalist, excessively competitive hellspace where, brother is pitted against brother, and everyone is just seeking money at the expense of family, community, etc. And again, there's some truth to that, but the other is that sometimes these people leave for different reasons. Perhaps they were coerced into leaving. That's really hard to tell. There's always going to be those who are going to say, well, were they spies to begin with? I mean, that is a valid question, always, with North-South relations and the movement of people between the two countries. I have no information which would say definitively for any of them, so I'm not going to speculate. But the other thing is that, and I think people maybe forget this sometimes, North Korea is home for them, and home has a powerful pull. I think we can all identify with that. And for those North Koreans who have resettled in South Korea, yes, they're in a Korea, but they're still not really home. And that has a powerful pull. And, well, to be quite frank, that doesn't necessarily come out in read effector press conferences, what we're talking about right here.
Yep.
But it is certainly something that will come out in defector interviews. You can read about it in media, and it's talked about a lot with those who I've sat down and spoken with at length. That there's nothing quite like home. It's really simple. It's a basic human condition to be attracted to home. I think that combined sometimes with the struggles will lead people to want to leave. But, and this bears emphasizing, almost all of them do not. Because, yeah. I mean, you are right. I mean, I don't have the latest number on hand right now, but it's less than 100, right? Far less than 100. And there's over 30,000 who have resettled in South Korea. So these are exceptions that prove the rule. And the rule is that resettled North Korean migrants or defectors, once they get to South Korea, they stay. Or they try to onward migrate to another country, but they're not going back to North Korea, despite the fact that there is definitely a pool to go back there. But everything else being what it is, I think they know opportunity, health, and well-being lie elsewhere.
Okay, that seems like a pretty good point to end the podcast on. Thanks for coming on. People can follow your work at Steven Denney, at Steven Denney 86. And of course, you write regularly for Sino-NK and the Diplomat, and you are on other platforms as well across the internet. It's hard to miss you. So, Steven Denney, thanks for coming on the Career Now podcast.
Thanks for having me on.